Is the second raid we've seen in 24 hours. News Corp journalist Annika Smethurst had her home raided as well in relation to that story that Charlotte referred to about the Australian Signals Directorate. It's something that the Prime Minister Scott Morrison was asked to respond to overnight as he was doing a press conference in London.
We have clear rules and protections for freedom of the press, and there are also clear rules protecting Australia's national security, and everybody should operate in accordance with all of those laws. I support the powers that the agencies have under our laws.
Opposition leader Anthony Albanese was also asked to respond to the story about Annika Smethurst before this raid at the ABC took place. He had much stronger words.
Democracies rely upon freedom of the press. Annika Smethurst is a serious professional journalist who has my respect. It is quite frankly, I think, outrageous that 7 officers spent 7.5 hours in her home.
These stories raise serious concerns about freedom of the press as well as protection for whistleblowers, which is crucial for any journalist. Joining us now live to discuss these raids is the Legal Affairs Editor at The Australian, Chris Merritt. Chris, thank you for joining us. This really is quite alarming in 24 hours to have these 2 raids when there's no issue that is apparent about the accuracy of the stories or the fact they were in the public interest. It's just about where the stories came from.
That's exactly right. This is an attempt to bypass the protection of journalist sources, seize material from reporters that identify confidential sources and prosecute those people. Now that is a retrograde move for the community, the entire community. This is not an issue for journalists, this is an issue for the entire community. Australia is better off because Annika Smethurst reported that there was a serious move to allow government agencies to electronically spy on Australians within Australia. The ABC report about alleged killings by Australian forces in Afghanistan was an issue of public importance. It needed to be broadcast. The rights and wrongs of that story I won't go into, but the very fact that the subject matter concerned something of electoral and political consequence should mean that both those issues, the Smethurst report and the ABC's report, should be protected by the implied constitutional freedom of political and electoral discourse.
And it's just impossible to ignore the timing of these raids. We've just come through a federal election and neither of these stories are new. I mean, the Annika Smethurst story was at least a year old and the Afghan files stories were from 2017. Yes,
the Smethurst story in particular, the delay is there's questions to be answered. Let me put it that way. 14 months ago is when she burst into print, and now, just after the election, her house is raided. Now, I think the government needs to explain exactly when it briefed the AFP on this information. If that briefing took place before the election, the AFP needs to explain why it delayed the raid until after the election. If the briefing took place after the election, the government needs to explain why it delayed. Those questions need to be answered.
And we've seen Christian Porter, the Attorney-General, at least in reference to Annika Smethurst's story, say that she's not the direct target of their investigation, but has just become part of it. Is that any cause for comfort?
No. In fact, that makes things even worse. What that shows is that the government knows and is quite happy to use this mechanism to erode the confidentiality of journalist sources. It also means that Smethurst is not out of the woods. If her confidential source is eventually prosecuted, she may be subpoenaed as a witness. And if she's subpoenaed as a witness and asked, is this your confidential source, she is bound by the Journalist Code of Ethics to refuse to answer. That could place her in contempt of court and could send her to prison.